All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are previewing the Falcons running back position as we head into training camp, talking about, can Cordarrelle Patterson have a repeat breakout season? How big a role can we expect out of rookie Tyler Allgeier, as well as the other ongoing roster battles at the running back position? And of course, we're also going to be locked on fullbacks today.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Blue Nile. Make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com, and Locked On listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. This podcast exclusive includes engagement. Use code Locked On at checkout. So, guys, I thank you as usual for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms Monday through Friday, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as on YouTube. And you should subscribe and hit that bell and give us a like to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. You'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So today we are continuing our training camp preview series, going position by position. We've already talked about the quarterback position earlier this week. We'll be talking about the running back position. We'll be talking about the other pieces of the roster on offense over the next few days and over the course of the week before the 4th of July holiday weekend. And, you know, when we do these things, we're doing the format a little differently, not just sort of talking about the key roster battles, which we will touch upon, but we sort of have big questions of not only the season, but also the summer. Right. And our big question of the season is actually two questions, although one of them is related to our big question of the summer. And that one is specific to Tyler Algiere, if he's ready to be that sort of workhorse tailback that the Falcons are looking for between the tackles this season. And the bigger question of the season that we'll start off today's episode talking about is whether or not, you know, how much mojo does Cordarrelle Patterson still have left? Right? How much leftover mojo does he have from his breakout 2021 season? And it's a fair question to have because there isn't a rich history of running backs that have their breakout seasons at age 30 and then continue that in the years beyond. It's usually a 1 year sort of wonder. Justin Forsett is a good example of that, of a player. I think it was his age 29 season where he had that monster year with the Ravens. And then, you know, prior to that and after that was primarily a backup tailback. One example of a player that did have a breakout and then followed that up with another solid year was Lamar Smith. We talked about Lamar Smith, the former Saint, Panther, and Dolphins running back in January when we did our positional breakdown of the running back position and talked about whether or not Cordarrelle Patterson can be expected to have another good year. And Lamar Smith had basically averaged like 500 yards from scrimmage for the first like 5 or 6 years of his NFL career. And then at age 30 had a breakout year, I believe, with the Dolphins, where he had like 1,200 yards or 1,400 yards from scrimmage. And then the following year had another 1,000+ yards or whatever the case may be. And then sort of went off into obscurity. So there is some precedent for a guy to follow it up with another solid year like Lamar Smith, but not too many examples of that. And so one wonders if Patterson, you know, everything just came together for him last year. One of the things that didn't quite come together for him was his health. And you do wonder about, you know, an older player. It's not like players typically get healthier the older they get. And so I think the Falcons are going to make considerable effort this season to try to keep Patterson as healthy as possible, just because they don't necessarily have a Mike Davis on the roster. Or we'll talk about whether or not Tyler Allgeier can fill those shoes as we continue today's episode. But with Patterson, I think they're going to try to dial back his touches. All right. I still think he'll wind up being the primary ball carrier for the Falcons at this running back position, and certainly get a large number of touches. But it would not surprise me if the Falcons try to dial back his carries and then try to balance that out by giving him more opportunities in the passing game, which is where we know Patterson really shined last year, not so much as a runner. He was fine to solid as a runner, but nothing special. I don't think the goal for the Falcons is to have Cordarrelle Patterson rush for 1,000 yards this season, right? Another like 600-yard season would be great for them from a rushing standpoint, and they're hoping a guy like Tyler Allgeier, among others, could supplement that with their success on the ground. So it'll be interesting to see how the Falcons sort of handle Patterson's workload. I've mentioned before on the podcast, going back to mandatory minicamp last week starting, that I don't think we'll see a lot of Patterson throughout the summer, whether it's in the preseason, as well as him possibly getting rest days in practice as part of this strategy for the Falcons to try to get Cordarrelle Patterson to last an entire season. We know he suffered that ankle injury. I think it was an ankle against the Cowboys in week 10 last year. And it had, he didn't really limit him too much the next couple of weeks. He did miss one game, but we saw him have his best game of the season a few weeks later against the Jaguars. But then over the last month of the season, it seemed to limit him a lot more. And you saw Mike Davis starting to get, the majority of the carries down the home stretch of that season. So I think the Falcons want to avoid that fate, and they know, given Patterson's increased age, that they will have to work a little bit harder to avoid that fate. So we'll see how it all plays out this season. I certainly think Patterson has another good year in him. I don't know if it's going to be quite as good as last year was, but I think there's reasons to be optimistic that any sort of step back he may take as a runner, he can take a big step forward as a pass catcher, and so those will sort of balance things out. But we'll have to just wait 6 months to see how that plays out, but we won't necessarily have to wait 6 months to see how things play out for Tyler Allgeier, because the story of his season, whether or not he can sort of be that more of that workhorse that can take the slack off of Cordarrelle Patterson, we might find, or at least have a better idea of by the end of this summer. So within the next 3 months, and that will get us into our big question of the summer of how ready Tyler Allgeier is to be a big part of this Falcons rushing attack. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But before we get there, I do want to let you know that the NBA draft is coming this week on Thursday, and Locked On says there's one live show for the NBA draft is not enough. How about all the NBA teams covered by Locked On have a live show come Thursday night to get you ready for the big night and who your favorite team is going to pick. So if you have a favorite team, and if your team happens to be the Atlanta Hawks, if they have a YouTube channel here on Locked On, and I think most, if not all, of the NBA shows do, you can find your favorite team's YouTube channel and make sure you hit that bell and subscribe so that you know when they go live on Thursday night to give you that preview, as well as probably a postcast of who your favorite team picks. So check out Locked On Hawks on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. And guys, I also want to tell you about Rock Auto. With ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why wait while the person behind the counter orders parts on their computer when you already have a computer with access to rockauto.com at home or in your pocket? Save time and money when using Rock Auto instead of spending up to twice as much for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years with reliably low prices for every single customer. They have everything you need, from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Just go to rockauto.com right now and browse their easy-to-use website. See all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so that they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So, guys, once again, thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And today, we will be getting into the big question of the summer. Right, we already sort of talked about the big question of the season with Cordarrelle Patterson. Let's talk about the big question of the summer, and that's tied to the other second big question of the season. Is just sort of, is Tyler Allgeier ready to be a workhorse in his offense? And what we consider a workhorse is all relative. I don't expect Tyler Algier to have as big a role as Najee Harris did with the Steelers last year, or Jonathan Taylor with the Colts, or anything where they're getting 20 plus touches a game. But I do think ideally the Falcons would like to see Tyler Algier in that 10 to 12, if not 12 to 15 range of touches per game. And a lot of those could come on the ground. I think Algier can contribute in the passing game, but I don't think he's going to be their primary option there, just because of the presence of guys like Cordarrelle Patterson, as well as Damien Williams, who I think is a much more proven pass catcher and pass protector than Tyler Allgeier is. And so that's going to lead to Algier primarily getting a lot of those carries that I think the team is hoping that they can take off of Cordarrelle Patterson's plate and put him on Tyler Allgeier's. And we should see ample opportunity for him this summer. I don't know if we're going to see a ton of him in the preseason, because I do kind of wonder, given Arthur Smith's proclivities to try to protect guys from getting hurt this season, and some of these rookies like Drake London, Tyler Algier, and Arnold Ebiketie that I'm personally counting on to have significant roles this season for this team at their various roster positions. I do wonder if we will see less of those guys during the preseason in order to avoid some of that injury risk than maybe some of the other rookies that are probably due to, have primarily roles on special teams, or just be role players or backups, or whatever the case may be. Someone like a Justin Schaefer, who we'll talk about later this week on our scatter report, is probably going to get a ton of action during the course of this preseason. So we'll see about that. But I think Algier, regardless of how much time and work he gets this preseason, has ample opportunity in front of him to put his best foot forward and sort of inspire us with a lot more confidence going into the season that he can be a legit force for this team this year. Now, the concern you have with Tyler Algier is the concern that you generally have with most Falcon rookie running backs, that despite that being a position that we know routinely often translates to success right away in the NFL, the Falcons haven't really had that much success with rookie running backs over the course of their history. Their record for yards from scrimmage as a rookie were set by William Andrews way back in 1979 with over 1,300, and number 2 on that list was set back in 2006 with Jarius Norwood's 735 yards from scrimmage. And so, Algier has an opportunity ahead of him to sort of eclipse Jarius Norwood. But part of me kind of sits here and it's a little bit skeptical, because when I look at the other, what I frankly see as more talented running backs that the Falcons have brought in recent memory over the last 20 or so years, like TJ Duckett and Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman, when I compare those caliber of running backs to Tyler Algier, I feel like those guys come out ahead of Tyler Algier. And that, that's not meant to be bashing Tyler Algier, just, being honest with I don't see him as like this unique and special running back prospect relative to a lot of the guys that the Falcons have brought in over the last 2 decades or so. And if those guys couldn't outperform Jarius Norwood or whatever the case may be, then why should I expect Tyler Algier? Well, the reason is because those guys didn't have quite the opportunity ahead of them that Tyler Algier has, right? That's the thing that Tyler Algier has going for him, not necessarily his unique and rare skill set. It's the fact that he's coming into a Falcons team that doesn't have an established veteran like TJ Duckett did when Work Done was already there, or Devontae Freeman was there when Steven Jackson was there. Or Devontae Freeman hadn't established himself by the time Tevin Coleman arrived in 2015. But he quickly showcased his ability and surpassed Tevin Coleman due in part to injuries that season, to basically showcase that he was the guy and will continue that over the next couple of years. So Tyler Algier doesn't have that. Again, that's not a knock on Cordarrelle Patterson, but he's not this established veteran RB1. He is the Falcons RB1 because they don't have better options. But he's not this guy that's like Work Done or Steven Jackson that has this massive pedigree and has been a starter for years and years and years in the league. So Tyler Algier has a unique opportunity ahead of him where he will get a chance to prove himself that these other guys didn't. And frankly, even though I'm not necessarily too optimistic that Tyler Algier is going to be significantly better than Mike Davis, if he's just exactly the same as Mike Davis from a production standpoint, who I believe had like 700 and something, 760, 780-ish yards from scrimmage last year, that would be number 2. That would surpass Jarius Norwood as number 2 and the second best Falcons rookie running back. So despite not necessarily being in love with Tyler Algiere as a prospect, I sit here and I say, you say he's going to be the second best rookie running back that the Falcons have ever had from a production standpoint. I would sit here and say, like, that's not a bad bet in the slightest, just because of the opportunity that he has ahead of him and the fact that I think a similar player in Mike Davis, who I think is probably a little bit more powerful than Tyler Algiere, but other than that, they pretty much check many of the same boxes, was able to produce for this Falcons team a year ago. And hopefully, as we discussed on yesterday's episode, we will see improvements there with the offensive line play and some changes to the Falcons running game. So Tyler Algiere has basically all I'm sitting here saying is we'll find out at the end of the summer if Tyler Algiere is ready to be this guy that we're talking about him being, but certainly the opportunity is there for him, and we just have to see if he takes advantage of that. Now we'll sort of wrap up the rest of today's training camp preview here on Locked On Falcons, talking about the other position battles at the running back position. Of course, we'll get into the Locked On Fullbacks portion of today's. We'll talk about, what we can expect from Avery Williams and Damien Williams, or guys like Qadree Ollison and Caleb Huntley on the outside looking in, and is there any possibility that Keith Smith will not be the Falcons fullback come week one? We'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But before we get there, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 shows with 4 different personalities: Jarvis Davis and Tenitra Batiste on ATL Day Ones, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and A to Z with Mark Zeno, all in the same podcast feed, giving you coverage of local sports as well as national sports. And also, if you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you'll get the Locked On Braves postcast, breaking down every Braves win and loss this season. So subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. And guys, I got to tell you about Built Bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, but it's even better than a candy bar, because Built Bars not only taste good, they're good for you. They're low in sugar, calories, and carbs, high in protein, high in fiber. Built Bar is always unveiling new flavors throughout the summer. So head on over to their website at built.com to see what the latest flavor is. But if you head on over there right now, you can get many of the same tried and true flavors like peanut butter brownie, mint brownie, cherry barcia, coconut almond, salted caramel, raspberry. They also have some of the puff flavors like brownie batter puff, caramel brownie, cookies and cream, chocolate, peanut butter, granola, double chocolate, and more available at built.com. Find your favorite or try them all with a mix box by heading over to built.com and use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So guys, let's talk about the rest of the Falcons running back position. And, let's start with Avery Williams and the position switch that he's made already this offseason, going from cornerback to running back. And while I think Avery Williams is probably a lock to make this roster, as good a bet as you could make in terms of making this roster due to his special teams value, I don't really think whether he has RB or CB listed next to his name is going to make all that much difference, because I don't think the Falcons have really any goals, I guess is maybe the right word, to have Avery Williams play a ton, whether he was at a cornerback on defense or on offense at running back. We might see maybe some gadget plays for him, some screens here, a jet sweep sprinkled here or there for him, Avery Williams, that is this upcoming season. But I don't see him being a huge part of the Falcons offense, whether it's this year or long term, in large part due to my concerns over his size and my general concerns over most running backs, his size when it comes to pass protection. And this was one of the reasons why a year ago, when we were all high on Javian Hawkins, I was not as much high on his long-term outlook here in Atlanta. I certainly thought there was a very good chance that he would make the roster a year ago, but his long-term outlook in Atlanta I didn't love, simply because one of the things I stated talking about that was there isn't a rich history of sub 190-pound running backs in the NFL. And I think Avery Williams is listed about like 187 or somewhere in that range. And the reason I think that is because those guys typically struggle to hold up in pass protection. Right? There's a handful of guys that are able to work around that, work done being an example of that. Jacquizz Rodgers, I think, was like 195, Darren Sproles, etc. But for the most part, those guys are giving up too much size to the linebackers and edge rushers that they're going to have to sort of pick up as pass protectors. And this is a thing that I've stressed on this podcast for a number of years, and probably will continue to stress on this podcast, that the most underrated aspect, especially when it's considered by your average fan, the most underrated aspect of playing the running back position and your success and projecting long-term success in the NFL at the running back position is pass protection. In fact, I won't 100% make this argument, but I think you can make a pretty compelling argument that pass protection is going to have a far greater impact, or a running back's ability in pass protection is going to have a far greater influence on his longevity in the NFL than his actual running ability or his pass catching ability. Because, we know that running backs treated a dime a dozen position because running skills aren't necessarily ubiquitous. And it isn't like, oh, there's only 5 good guys that can, carry a football, like there's only like 15 good quarterbacks in the NFL, right? There's 100 plus guys that are more than capable of getting you 4 or 5 yards when you hand the ball off to them. And we know that catching a football is not a unique skill that only a handful of individuals on this planet can do. But being able to pick up Demario Davis is a skill, or Devin White or Von Miller or whoever. Being able to block one of those guys is a skill that only a handful of people, I think, on this planet, maybe several handfuls of people on this planet, can realistically accomplish. And so that's why pass protection is a big part of it. And I think that's a big reason why we will probably see much more of Damien Williams this season than maybe a lot of people assume. That, as I've already kind of suggested and implied on this podcast, it'll be, a 1-2 punch of Cordarrelle Patterson and Tyler Allgeier this year as the Falcons 1-2 punch. But Damien Williams really has an opportunity to sort of disrupt that, similar to what we saw with Mike Davis. Like, I think a big part of what Mike Davis brought to the table was his pass protection skills. He wasn't elite in that regard, but he was good enough that the Falcons didn't feel like there was a liability there. And so that would allow them to put Davis in the backfield, and then you do all the various things that they did with Cordarrelle Patterson. And I do wonder, with Tyler Allgeier, is he capable of doing that? Pass protection was not a strength of his at BYU. Pass protection is typically not a strength of very many running backs coming into the NFL. And I think this is also a contributing factor to why we don't have a great history of Falcons rookie running backs coming in right away and impacting, because a lot of those guys need, some seasoning, I guess you could say, when it comes to developing that pass protection skills. And so, if Algiere is not going to be that guy this year, maybe he can be that guy in future years. And I don't think Avery Williams is ever going to be that guy. That does give Damien Williams, Avery's, bigger brother, an opportunity, particularly this year. And we might see, there's a possibility that as we get further in the season, that when Patterson needs a breather, because Damien Williams is a lot more trusted in those passing down situations due to his pass protection skills, it will be Damien Williams off the bench more often than Tyler Allgeier. So we'll sort of have to see. And that especially becomes true if Tyler Allgeier doesn't take advantage of the opportunities that he has this summer in showcasing his ability and his toughness and physicality as a runner, in addition to helping out in pass protection. And I think pass protection is a big reason why someone like Qadree Ollison hasn't gotten as much run as I think a lot of people think he should have gotten over the last 3 years, given his ability as a runner. Going back to the point I made earlier about pass protection skills being arguably more valuable than rushing skills. And I think that puts a guy like Ollison, as well as Caleb Huntley, on the outside looking in as far as making this roster. I think we're likely to see the Falcons keep 4 tailbacks in Cordarrelle Patterson, Damien Williams, Tyler Allgeier, and Avery Williams. And I'm hard pressed to see any of those guys getting cut, especially Damien Williams, given that he's the most proven pass protector of this group. And Ollison has struggled when it's come to pass protection in the past. That's a big contributing factor to why he hasn't gotten much run. And we'll see if Huntley can show more of that. I thought Huntley impressed last preseason, and showed a lot more juice, given his size, than he certainly showed at the collegiate level, and was arguably, more explosive running back than Javian Hawkins, who, many people thought was one of the most explosive running backs in last year's draft class. So that's a good sign for Caleb Huntley. And I think really Ollison and Huntley are competing for practice squad spots for those aforementioned regions. And I think Ollison probably gets the edge over Huntley, just because he's a little bit more proven on special teams, and that's going to go a lot longer to, finding a spot on the practice squad, because in the world where there are injuries to the running back position, it's not as if the Falcons are going to be automatically turning to, okay, our practice squad guy is the best runner here. That guy's going to probably jump into being like the third running back. And so therefore his value is going to more likely come on special teams than it is as a true runner. But we'll see. Huntley will certainly do himself a great service if he can show some special teams coverage ability this summer when he gets those opportunities, and that will certainly enhance his chances of potentially taking that practice squad spot. But I wouldn't write off either one of these guys from making the roster if they have especially a strong summer. we'll just sort of have to see, but I think they're both right on the outside looking in. So let's move on to the most important part of today's conversation, which is the Locked On fullbacks portion of today's episode. And there's not a whole lot to say. Keith Smith has that fullback position on lockdown. He's been solid these last couple of years. He did not play at all in the preseason last summer. And that led to John Rainey, who was on the Falcons practice squad for the entire year, sort of converted tight end H-back out of Northwestern, undrafted free agent, getting the bulk of those fullback snaps. He didn't necessarily impress me in those regard, but the Falcons didn't really have better options last year. And I'll be curious if they have better options this summer. I'm curious if we see some of these other tight ends, because there's not another fullback on the roster. Ollison has dabbled as a fullback in the preseason, going back to, I think, his rookie year back in 2019. I doubt that's going to be the plan, but maybe, you never know. The Falcons may realize halfway through this summer and say, look, Ollison, this is your best chance of making the roster, or maybe showing some more versatility if you can double duty as this. But I think more than likely you'll see the Falcons potentially try one of these other tight ends in addition to John Rainey. I'll be curious to see, particularly someone like a John Fitzpatrick or Tucker Fisk, if they get some opportunities to line up in the backfield and be that lead blocker. That will give Fitzpatrick a lot more versatility and help his chances of sticking on the roster. Although I would sit here and say that he's a relatively safe bet to make the roster, but certainly would only enhance his chances of sticking if he could be that sort of emergency option in the event of a Keith Smith injury, right? We're not really talking about Keith Smith being challenged for his job, just in the event, what if he tweaks his ankle, being a lead blocker for Tyler Algiere on a goal line run or something like that, who's going to come in and the following week and play fullback for the Falcons, and having that option, whether it's John Rainey, whether it's John Fitzpatrick, Tucker Fisk, sort of in the Patrick Ricard mold, defensive lineman, tight end, 280 plus pound guy from Stanford, Patrick Ricard, the Ravens fullback, who's dabbles as defensive lineman, can play some tight end, 280 plus pounds in that role. So maybe we could see Tucker Fisk. That would be intriguing. That would be fun, certainly for folks like me and the other 12 of you that are subscribed to Locked On Fullback. So that's the end of that conversation. We'll just sort of have to wait and see who's getting those second, third, fourth quarter preseason snaps at the fullback position. Hopefully we'll see more of Keith Smith this summer in the preseason, but probably won't see too much of him because he's got nothing really to prove there. But we'll see how that goes, guys. And if you have any feedback that you want to provide on any of the roster battles or players I discussed on today, you think Patterson is going to have a better or worse season than he had a year ago? Do you think Tyler Allgeier will be, one of the best Falcons rookie running backs that we've seen, or will he be sort of the typical guy that struggles to make that transition to the next level? How much of Damien Williams' role you see? Do you see Qadree Ollison or Caleb Huntley sticking on the roster over a Williams, or in addition to a Williams? What are your thoughts on the fullback battle? I'm all ears for all of those discussions. You can leave a comment here on Locked On Falcons. You can send me an email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can hit me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons as well to provide me that feedback. Tomorrow, we should be talking about the wide receiver position and breaking down the training camp question marks there, sort of asking about, is Drake London going to be that wide receiver one that falls into the Roddy White, Julio Jones footsteps and legacy, that continues that legacy, or does he not quite live up to that? That will be one of the questions that we will be talking about tomorrow, as well as how the rest of the wide receiver depth chart is going, where unlike running back as well as quarterback, there's a lot more sort of variability there at the wide receiver, a lot more influx there. And so we'll get into all of that on tomorrow's episode, guys. But before we duck out of here, guys, even though the NBA draft is Thursday night, that doesn't mean that you can't, simulate and have your mocks of the upcoming NBA draft. Still going strong on the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft as part of the Locked On Podcast Network's comprehensive coverage of the draft, building that draft board, getting all the various Locked On NBA insiders as well as Odyssey insiders to break down this Thursday night's big draft. So go check out the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft on your preferred podcast app, whether that's Apple, Odyssey, Google, or Spotify. Just search for it in its own feed and you will find it. Ultimate NBA mock draft. So guys, that will do it for us here on another training camp preview. We got more to talk about for the rest of the week, as well as the upcoming Justin Schaefer scouter report. And should be done with John Fitzpatrick next week as well, probably closer to the middle of the week for that one. So we are probably roughly 7 or 8 days away from wrapping up these scouter reports. And just give me and yourself a high five that we were able to stretch out this premium draft content until the final week of June, as is per usual. So appreciate it, guys. Till then.